Hello everyone, welcome to another S6 philosophy class. Today we are going to grapple with another topic, a new topic. We're moving on from our discussion of Emmanuel Levinas, and today we are going to look at another contemporary philosopher, one of my favorites. His name is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was Austrian born, came from an aristocratic family, wealthy, but Wittgenstein himself eventually gave away his wealth uh, to other people, mostly to artists. And being Austrian, you can see here, I suppose, a coincidence of history. He was actually once classmates with a very young Adolf Hitler there. So Wittgenstein is one of my favorite philosophers. I read this biography of Wittgenstein written by Ray Monk. It's a big book. It's a gigantic book, but it's worth reading. I read it when I was a little older than you, maybe in my 20s, early 20s, when I was 21, 22. So I highly recommend this book, even if even if your main interest is not philosophy. It's still engaging. It's still a very good read. So Wittgenstein, as a young man, he was quite restless. So at first he thought he wanted to go into aeronautics engineering, but the practical side of engineering didn't suit him well, but the more abstract aspects, yes. So he tried his hand at engineering in Berlin, eventually moved to Manchester, but then he he came to see that what he was really interested in was the foundation of mathematics. So he went into that for a while, and then eventually he realized that if he wanted to seriously think about the foundations of mathematics, he might as well go into philosophy. So at first he was actually studying with Frege. That's you don't have to remember him, but he's one of the great early 20th century philosophers about language, and then Wittgenstein comes into contact with Bertrand Russell, a giant of a philosopher. So Wittgenstein went to Cambridge to study with Russell, and Wittgenstein was a very strange person, but at the same time, he was somebody who was quite intense and really wanted to get to the bottom of things. So he was quite engaging. He was considered by many as a real genius. So at least at first, he hit it off with Bertrand Russell, but eventually they had you can say an intellectual falling out. They came to discover that they disagreed on very fundamental things, so they would part ways. Anyway, that's not the test material. It's just background information. Um, for today's class, we're going to focus on the early work of Wittgenstein, the earliest one, which is called Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. People have always referred to this as simply the Tractatus. Wittgenstein wrote this at a very young age and during the First World War. Okay, he was in jail, he carried this around, and he wrote parts of it when he was in prison. So came out in 1921. It was published in 1921. He would write, a number of things in between. I mean, after the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, or his students at Cambridge would record his lectures, and those texts would circulate. And then gradually, he also started writing short texts, a series of short texts. They're more aphoristic, like short paragraphs. And he never published that set of aphorisms, that set of smaller texts himself. He died in 51, but his students, found those writings, collected them, and published eventually. the Philosophical Investigations. What's important here, why I'm talking about these two books, is that these two books actually changed the course of the history of philosophy. They're immensely influential. So the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, this changed the face of the history of philosophy. After this, philosophy was done in a different way. And then after a few decades, Wittgenstein would change his mind, he would change course, and he would reverse many of the things that he said in the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. And so the Philosophical Investigations strikes, you can say strikes a new path and goes another way. And, and this also has a profound impact on the way people started to think about language. That's actually our focus today. We're talking about Wittgenstein, but I would like to talk to you about language. And we have to see what the Tractatus says about language. What is language? Okay. According to Wittgenstein, language mirrors the world. Language reflects the world. But then ordinary language is misleading. Ordinary language, the kind of the language that we speak in our everyday lives, it's not clear enough. Okay? So Wittgenstein makes this bold statement that, what is ideal is a basic proposition. Now, it's not very clear what he actually meant. People disagree about what he meant by the basic proposition. But for our purposes, because we're simplifying a lot of things here, you can say, for instance, a basic proposition like the cat is on the mat. This is clear. It points to things that are in the world. The cat that is on the mat. It also points out the relationship between the objects, okay, the cat and the mat, the cat being on the mat. Okay, this is the ideal kind of proposition. This is the ideal way to use language because it's clear, it's straightforward, and it reflects what's actually out there in reality. And Wittgenstein also says that, all the languages in the world, since they are imprecise, since they are not clear enough, since they are most of the time misleading, we should reduce those languages to basic propositions, which are clear, straightforward, and have this mirroring function. I'll just give you an example, okay? Why does it make sense for Wittgenstein to think this? Okay, to think that we have to reduce our ordinary languages to an essential language. That's why we said this is an essentialist view. So he's prescribing, he's saying this is how language is supposed to be. Does it make sense? Does it make sense to say that? I'll give you a couple of examples. Our languages contain ambiguities, and the way we use our languages are oftentimes, imprecise, are open to misunderstanding. For instance, the famous case of Croesus of Lydia, ancient Greek king, bothered by the Persians, wanted to attack the Persians. So he goes to the Oracle of Delphi and asks, "What do I do?" And the Oracle of Delphi says, after crossing the Halys, Croesus will destroy a great empire. And so he goes to war with Persia, misunderstanding the pronouncement of the oracle. And what is the result of that war? Croesus is defeated by the Persians because this was unclear. This was imprecise. It was open to many interpretations, or at least two. Okay? Or another more contemporary example. How are jokes possible? How are dad jokes possible? I'll give you one. A Mexican magician tells the audience he's going to disappear on the count of 3. He says, 1, 2, What comes after? And then poof, he disappears without a trace. How is it possible for us human beings to make jokes? It's because language is ambiguous. It's because it's open to so many different meanings, because it's open to being misunderstood. So we can understand, Wittgenstein's point. Maybe, it's better to reduce the languages in the world to one particular language, to the very essence of language, to the bare bones of language. So according to him, according to Wittgenstein, this is, by the way, the first page of the Tractatus. According to him, it's usually, by the way, it's usually published. The Tractatus is usually published in German and English at the same time. So one page here, German, and then you have the English translation here. Okay, so strict correspondence between language and the world. According to Wittgenstein, there's a strict correspondence between the two. Language reflects the world. Language consists of propositions. Propositions are made up of basic propositions, and basic propositions are made up of names. And there's a strict correspondence there because the world is made up of facts, and facts themselves are made up of states of affairs. So simpler facts and states of affairs are made up of objects, and objects are, we refer to objects by the use of names, and so on and so forth. So there's a very strict correspondence between language and the world. Now, in this system, though, we can only make propositions about what is actually out there in the world. Basic propositions have to reflect states of affairs. Okay, what state of affairs that we find in the world. This means, by implication, that certain areas of our life, they cannot be expressed. We cannot talk about them, at least according to the system. For instance, religion, ethics, art. Religion talks about the immortality of the soul, the existence of God. Ethics, what is good, what is bad. Art, value judgments, what is beautiful, what is ugly. But you see, we're here in these areas, we're using concepts that are abstract. Where do you see ugliness walking around? Where do you see goodness walking around in the world? So from the point of view of this system, it doesn't make sense to talk about these things. So for instance, in later parts of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein says it is clear that ethics cannot be expressed because ethics is transcendental. It's beyond the world. It's beyond the things that we see in the world. And ethics and aesthetics are what? They're one and the same. If we're talking about values, where do you see values walking around? Okay, can you pinpoint a value? We can pinpoint things that we consider to be valuable, but not value itself. And how can we talk about the immortal soul? Wittgenstein says death is not an event of life. Death itself is not something we live through. If we have questions about the immortal soul, if there is ever a solution, Wittgenstein tells us that solution is beyond space and time. That's not something we can talk about here now. And so the last line of the Tractatus is, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent. There are just certain things that we cannot talk about. If we talk about them, we fall into ambiguities, we fall into nonsense. And it's better to stick to clear, straightforward language that mirrors what's actually happening in the world. In the next recording, we're going to talk about the philosophical investigations. And like I said, this work departs from the Tractatus. It's more descriptive rather than prescriptive. It recognizes the importance of describing what's actually happening in the world. It abandons essentialism. It also takes into account the diversity of languages, and that languages are connected to ways of life of human beings. I'll see you in the next class.